Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. I want to talk about some of the techniques I used, especially in Photoshop, on this latest image of the Spaghetti Nebula. And if you do visit the website and go to the blog, you'll find that there's a before and after with a slider, so you can see the star field as it looked in RGB, and with narrowband data and reduced stars bringing out the Spaghetti Nebula that's kind of hiding amongst the stars. So I think that's kind of a neat way to look at it. But let's talk about how I put it together. And there's a couple techniques that I used. First of all, I've been using Deep Sky Stacker as my kind of front end and then doing the bulk of the processing in Photoshop. And lately I've been exploring PixInsight, and PixInsight is where I processed the front end image integration and calibration for this, and then still did the finishing work in Photoshop. So let me just talk briefly about what I did in PixInsight. I have been stacking this data kind of day by day as I've accumulated more data over the last several days. And I'm up to 56 frames of hydrogen and 58 of oxygen, and that seems to have reached a point of sufficiency. So I doubt if I'll go any further. And what I did was basically reviewed this by blinking through the data and moving the frames that I didn't think measured up or that had part of the observatory wall in it or something. I moved those to a rejects folder, so I have just the good data in the main folders, and added those as lights, and then also with calibration and darks and flats, and ran that through the WBPP script. Once it was through the script, I did a dynamic background extraction to even it out somewhat, and I saved that as a 16-bit TIFF, and then I also ran StarNet version 2 and saved that as a 16-bit TIFF. So when I ended up, I had the RGB data that I had already stacked a few days ago for the stars, and enough was enough on that, because really all I'm after is the stars. And then for the hydrogen and oxygen, I saved those as both a starred version and as a starless version. And just because of the way things worked, they don't align. So the stars and in the RGB version and the hydrogen and alpha, hydrogen and oxygen, wound up using different reference frames, so I have to align those in Photoshop also. So let's jump into Photoshop and take a look at the process there, because that's really the piece I want to talk about. So if you look at the layer stack over here on the right, and if you've watched any of my videos before, you know that I never flatten an image. So this has all of the layers still intact to the point that I can go back to the oxygen layer and make a change, and it will be reflected in the final image. So at the bottom I have the hydrogen all by itself, and if I Alt-click on the visibility eyeball for just that layer, it will hide everything but that layer, and there is the hydrogen layer after it's been kind of retouched and cleaned up a little bit. And then if I Alt-click on that eyeball again, it'll turn all those layers back on. And I can do the same thing with oxygen. So the cleaned up oxygen layer, that's what it looks like all by itself, and you'll notice that it's in cyan. And the reason for that, turn it back on, if you look over on the right, you'll see that the layer styles icon is there. And if I double click on that, what that's going to show is the reason that we have a color image is because when I loaded all of the layers, I converted it to RGB, and then on the oxygen layer, because I want to have an HOO image, I want hydrogen to be in red, and then oxygen to be green and blue. So the simplest way to do that is on the oxygen layer, I just turn off the red channel in the oxygen layer, and so the oxygen layer contributes green and blue and replaces the green and blue from the hydrogen layer at the bottom, which has red, green, and blue, all three. So that gives me an HOO image without having to do cut and paste and playing with the channels, just by turning those colors on and off. If I wanted to explore different color schemes, I could do that. If I look at, and let's just look at the hydrogen, I have two layers here. I have, and I'll turn off all of the others, I have a starless layer, and then I have the corresponding layer with stars intact. And I used those when I first loaded all of the 4 hydrogens and oxygens. I also loaded the star layer on top, and then I aligned everything to that star layer because I had others that I had referenced to that star layer. So I wanted to use the star layer and align the hydrogen and oxygen to the stars rather than the other way around. And the way you do that is just by selecting all of the layers that you want to align by clicking on one, shift clicking at the other end, and then turning on the star layer in difference blending mode, and that lets you very easily move around or do a free transform on these layers to align with the stars. Once that was done, then I could start working on the starless layer, and it has some just overall ununiformity. It's a little bit of a hot spot, it looks like, in the center, and I feel like that's an artifact from my hydrogen filter rather than actual data, so I want to kind of even that out. And I did that here with a levels adjustment with a mask, and you can see the mask thumbnail is mostly black, which is hiding that effect other than in a white area. So that's what the mask looks like. So that's evening this out a little bit. And then I applied a levels adjustment, and if you look at the levels adjustment, it's really not changing much, but the levels adjustment is in soft light blending mode, and just by doing it in soft light blending mode, that increases contrast. So it kind of gives me a free contrast boost without having to move sliders. And then this last layer is another burning and dodging layer where I tried to even it out even more. And what I really paid attention to was the artifacts from StarNet. You can still see some here. Yeah, if I turn off the layer, you can see they pop out a little bit more. But basically it's a matter of working with a very low opacity brush. So if you tap the B for the brush tool and work at a very low opacity, if the layer's in soft light blending mode, a little bit of dark on the layer will darken, a little bit of light will lighten. So if I look right here, for instance, this looks like it's just a little bit of a bright area from StarNet. If I've got my opacity set at 5%, I can just darken this down a little bit and blend that in a little bit better with the background. Same way here. And even though this image is essentially done, you can almost always go back and find little things to improve. So it's just a matter of lightening and darkening, and in some cases you may need to add a little bit of noise to those bright and dark areas that are created by star removal. Putting the stars back in also disguises a lot of this, but I'm working on a blank layer in soft light blending mode with a low opacity brush, and I just use the X key to toggle back and forth between white and black, which toggles between lightening and darkening. And then I can also change the brush opacity if I need to. Right now I'm at a very low opacity. If I look right here, you can see a little bit of a satellite trail that made it through, and most of that could be taken out if I go back to the starless layer and go to the healing brush, actually the spot healing brush, make it very small, so it's just a little bit bigger than that trail. If I click here and then shift click up here, it will draw a straight line and take that out. And it looks like it didn't do a very good job on that, so I'm going to Control Z because that trail is probably doing less damage than taking it out. So that's the basic work I did on the hydrogen layer of cleaning up the little details from star removal. I did the same thing on the oxygen layer to clean up those details, and that left me with a fairly clean nebula, the supernova remnant, but there's a lot of also smudges that are very obvious, plus some looks like some star flares in the corners. And because there's really nothing there, I'll deal with that separately. So now that I've got it to this level, I can do an overall curves adjustment to adjust contrast, and then I also added a levels adjustment layer to adjust it a little bit more. Another soft light layer to do some selective lightening and darkening, burning and dodging by painting with a low opacity white or black brush. And then I want to deal with all of this blank area outside, and I basically just replaced that with a blank layer with some noise added so that it matches the inside. So the steps to do that: first I added come down here, add a solid color layer, and I chose something like a 25 RGB, 25, 25, 25, somewhere in that range, because that's about where I'm going to wind up with the inside. And then I added a mask, and what this mask is doing is hiding that adjustment layer, or that solid fill layer, hiding it everywhere but around the outside of the nebula. And it's a little bit of a soft layer, so it blends from inside to outside. And then the last thing I do is add noise to that, so that the noise in this blank outside area matches and blends with the amount of noise in the inside. And then I've got I can fine tune that by adding a levels adjustment. If I need to add a little bit of brightness and darkness, I can do that again with a soft light. The next thing I did, there's still some noisy areas in here that are in the deep shadows, so I added another solid fill with added noise, and this time I added it in lighten blending mode. And what that is doing is just kind of filling in some of these noise areas that are inside the nebula and evening it out even more. But because it's in lighten blending mode, it's only lightening the background. And this is when you have to be very cautious with, because it's real easy if you make it too bright, it will start to obliterate some of this very fine dark detail. So it's finding that fine line between smoothing out the background and where it starts to take over some of the detail. And again, I'm fine-tuning that with a levels adjustment. And we're about to the top of the layer stack. There's just some overall levels and a hue saturation to kind of make some final adjustments to the look of the nebula overall. And then in the top layer group is the stars. And in this case, I'm adding the stars pretty much as they are, other than I did add I duplicated the stars layer and added a little bit of a Gaussian blur so that the stars get a little bit softer. And when I turn that layer on, that'll put the stars in, and that gets us to pretty much the finished image. I typically would save this and load it into Lightroom, where I would do any final tweaks on contrast, brightness. One thing I like to do sometimes in Lightroom is use either a radial local adjustment or a brush. And if you use just a little bit, I mean just a very little bit of a negative dehaze, that brings out some of this fine kind of filigreed hydrogen and oxygen a little bit more. So sometimes it does a nice job just bringing out the fine nebula. So those were the techniques I wanted to share. The main two are using layers, a blank layer in soft light blending mode, so that you can selectively lighten and darken areas by painting with a very low opacity brush, usually in the 2% to 10% range. And of course, the other technique I've talked about before is simply putting your layer in using a layer style, as we did here on the oxygen layer. If I look at the layer style, which I can get to by just double-clicking on the layer outside of the layer name, and that's not the right layer. It's right here. So the oxygen group, which contains both the starless and the starry version, I simply opened up the layer styles dialog, and in the advanced blending options, I simply turned off the red channel for the oxygen. And just for instance, if I wanted to make this a different color palette, I could, for instance, turn off blue and let oxygen be blue and hydrogen be red and green. If we want hydrogen to be green and oxygen to be purple, we could do that. So you can kind of play with these different color palettes just as a starting point, and then fine-tune from there. It might be interesting to have just the reverse of an HOO, to let oxygen be red and hydrogen be green and blue, and then you get this color combination. And I can do all of this even though the image is finished, because I haven't done any flattening of the image, and I haven't stamped any layers. So every layer from top to bottom is still live and represented in the final image. And I find I like to go back, I can go back to those starless layers and continue retouching and fine-tuning and so forth. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. If you find this useful, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under clear, dark skies. Thanks.